The global economy isn't a force of nature like the weather. It doesn't just happen, it's a machine. A massive, complex machine built by humans, for humans. And like any machine, it has a code. A simple set of rules that, once understood, makes the entire system predictable. For decades, this code has been hidden behind complex jargon and intimidating mathematics, making ordinary people feel like they have no control over their financial lives. This has led to immense and needless suffering, but it doesn't have to be this way. This is a journey to understand that code. It's an unconventional template, but it's a practical one. It will show you how to see the past, understand the present, and anticipate the future of the economy. Let's begin. The machine, for all its complexity, is built on one simple action, repeated billions of times a day. A transaction. Every time you buy a coffee, you create a transaction. It's a simple exchange. A buyer gives money or credit to a seller in exchange for a good, a service, or a financial asset. That's it. Now here's the first secret of the code. Credit spends just like money. When you add up all the money spent and all the credit spent, you get total spending. Total spending is the fuel that drives the entire economic machine. If we understand this, we understand everything. An economy is simply the sum of all transactions. A market, like the car market or the housing market, is just all the transactions for that one thing. The biggest players in this machine are people, businesses, and governments. The government itself has two key parts: the central government, which collects taxes and spends money, and the central bank, which is the most powerful player of all because it controls the total amount of money and credit in the system. It does this by setting interest rates and, when necessary, printing money. But of all the parts of the machine, the most important, the most powerful, and the least understood is credit. Credit is created out of thin air every time a lender and a borrower agree. A borrower gets money now in exchange for a promise to pay it back later, plus interest. As soon as that promise is made, credit is created, and it instantly becomes debt. Debt is an asset for the lender and a liability for the borrower. Why is this so critical? Because credit allows us to increase our spending. And here is the single most important line of code in the entire system. One person's spending is another person's income. Think about it. Every dollar you spend, someone else earns. And every dollar you earn, someone else spent. When you spend more, someone else earns more. When that person's income goes up, they become more creditworthy. Lenders are more willing to lend them money, so they can borrow more, which allows them to spend more, and their spending is yet another person's income. This is a self-reinforcing pattern. It is the engine of economic growth, and it is the reason we have cycles. This self-reinforcing pattern of transactions creates three great forces that drive the economic machine. Once you see them, you can never unsee them. Force number one: productivity growth. Over the long run, this is what matters most. It's the story of human progress. We invent, we learn, we work harder, we get better at what we do. A farmer with a tractor is more productive than a farmer with an ox. A programmer with AI is more productive than one without. This slow, steady march of innovation raises our living standards. If you were to graph it, it would be an almost straight line, ticking upward over centuries. But our lives don't feel like a straight line. They are full of booms and busts, of good times and bad times. That's because of the other two forces, which are all about credit. Force number two: the short-term debt cycle. This cycle typically lasts 5 to 8 years and is the one we feel most often. It starts with an expansion. Because credit is easy to get, people and businesses borrow more. They spend more. Since spending is income, incomes rise, asset values go up, and everyone feels richer. But when spending grows faster than the production of goods, prices rise. We call this inflation. The central bank hates high inflation because it destabilizes the economy. So, to cool things down, it raises interest rates. This makes borrowing more expensive. People borrow less and their existing debt payments get bigger. With less money to spend, spending slows down. And since one person's spending is another person's income, incomes begin to fall. This is a recession. If the recession gets too severe and inflation is no longer a problem, the central bank steps in again. It lowers interest rates, making it cheaper to borrow. People borrow more, spend more, and a new expansion begins. This cycle is controlled primarily by the central bank, and it repeats over and over again. Force number 3, the long-term debt cycle. This is the big one. It takes 75 to 100 years to play out, and most people only experience one in their lifetime. Each time a short-term debt cycle finishes, it usually ends with more growth and, crucially, more debt than the one before it. Why? Human nature. We have a natural inclination to borrow and spend more rather than pay back debt. Over decades, this causes debts to rise faster than incomes. This creates a leveraging phase. For a long time, everything looks great. Incomes are rising, asset values are soaring. The stock market is booming. People feel wealthy, so they borrow even more money to buy assets, pushing prices even higher. This is a bubble. But it cannot last forever. Eventually, the debt payments become so large that they grow faster than incomes. People are forced to cut their spending. Incomes fall, asset prices drop, and the entire cycle reverses. This is the long-term debt peak, and what follows is the most painful but most important part of the machine's function, the deleveraging. These three forces, the steady climb of productivity, the waves of the short-term cycle, and the massive tide of the long-term cycle, interact to create the economy we experience every day. Now, let's see how this machine has worked in the real world by looking at the greatest economic event of the modern era. To see the long-term debt cycle in action, there is no better example than the 1920s. After World War I, the United States entered a period of incredible productivity growth. New technologies like the automobile and the radio were changing the world. This was the leveraging phase of a massive long-term cycle. Credit was easy. Americans discovered buying on margin, to speculate in the stock market and installment plans, to buy cars and home appliances. They were pulling spending forward from their future selves on a massive scale. As spending soared, incomes soared, and asset prices, especially stocks, went parabolic. This was the bubble. People truly believed a new era of permanent prosperity had arrived. The long-term debt peak arrived in October of 1929. The stock market crashed, and the illusion was shattered. The machine now began its painful but necessary deleveraging. A deleveraging is different from a recession. In a recession, the central bank can lower interest rates to stimulate borrowing. In a deleveraging, interest rates are already at or near zero, so that tool is useless. The problem is that debt burdens are simply too big, and they must come down. History shows us there are only 4 ways this can happen. In the Great Depression, America tried them all. 1. Cut spending. This is austerity. People, businesses, and the government under President Hoover all tightened their belts. But when everyone cuts spending at the same time, incomes collapse even faster, and the debt burden actually gets worse. 2. Debts are reduced through defaults. Borrowers couldn't pay their loans. This led to bank runs and failures on a massive scale. When a debt is defaulted on, it disappears. But so does the lender's wealth. This is a depression. 3. Wealth is redistributed. As the poor suffered and the rich lost their paper fortunes, social tensions exploded. Populist anger rose, demanding that the wealthy be taxed to support the suffering masses. This happened within countries and between them, leading to political extremism and trade wars. 4. The central bank prints money. With interest rates at zero and the economy in a death spiral, the central bank is forced to act. This is what happened under President Franklin D. Roosevelt. The government launched massive stimulus programs, the New Deal, and the central bank, the Federal Reserve, effectively printed money to help fund them. Printing money is inflationary and stimulative, while the other 3 ways are deflationary and painful. A beautiful deleveraging happens when policymakers skillfully balance these 4 levers so that debts come down without causing either hyperinflation or a social revolution. The 1930s in America was a messy, often ugly, but ultimately successful deleveraging. It took a decade and a world war, but the debt burdens were reduced and the machine was reset for a new cycle. The end of World War II can be seen as the final act of the Great Deleveraging. The massive government spending effectively printed the money needed to clear the old debts and restart the economic machine on a clean slate. What followed was the greatest leveraging phase in human history, the post-war boom. From the late 1940s to the late 1960s, the machine was firing on all cylinders. The United States was the world's undisputed manufacturing powerhouse. Productivity growth was strong, the debt levels were low, and a new, healthy leveraging cycle began. A massive middle class emerged. Families bought homes in the suburbs, filled them with new appliances, and put a car in every driveway, all financed by credit. But this time, the debt was supported by rapidly rising incomes. Internationally, the Bretton Woods Agreement established the US dollar, backed by gold, as the world's reserve currency. This created a stable global system for trade and finance. Throughout this period, we can clearly see the short-term debt cycle at work. There were several minor recessions in the 1950s and 60s. Each time, the economy would overheat slightly. The Federal Reserve would raise interest rates to cool down inflation, causing a mild recession. Then it would lower rates again, and a new expansion would begin. These were healthy, manageable cycles on top of a powerful long-term upswing. This period shows how credit, when used to finance production and supported by strong income growth, can create decades of shared prosperity. The machine was working beautifully. But as the cycle continued, the old habits of human nature began to creep back in. By the late 1960s, the machine began to sputter. The U.S. had taken on massive new debts to finance both the Vietnam War and President Johnson's Great Society social programs. Incomes were rising, but they were starting to rise faster than productivity. The country was spending more than it was producing. Then, two critical things happened. First, in 1971, to pay for its deficits, the U.S. government abandoned the gold standard, allowing it to print dollars without restriction. Second, the 1973 OPEC oil embargo caused a massive spike in energy prices, a major shock to the machine's productivity. The result was a monster that economists at the time thought was impossible: stagflation. This was high inflation and high unemployment at the same time. The machine had broken in a new and terrifying way. Let's understand why. The government and central bank were pumping huge amounts of money and credit into the system, causing inflation. But the productivity of the machine was jammed by high energy costs, so you had too much money chasing too few goods. Incomes were rising in name only. In reality, people were getting poorer as the cost of living soared. The short-term cycle was broken. Lowering interest rates would make inflation worse. Raising them would crush an already weak economy. For a decade, the machine was stuck in the mud. The crisis was finally broken by the new Federal Reserve Chairman, Paul Volcker. In the early 1980s, he did what was previously unthinkable. He raised interest rates to brutal levels, as high as 20%. This triggered a deep and painful recession, deliberately putting the economy through a short-term debt cycle downturn. It was a harsh medicine, but it worked. It killed inflation and forced the system to become more productive. The machine had been reset, paving the way for the next great cycle. The cycle that began in the 1980s was different. After the painful reset of the Volcker years, a new leveraging phase began. But this time, the debt wasn't just being used to build factories and homes. It was being used to buy financial assets. This was the era of financialization. The economy experienced a period known as the Great Moderation, with stable growth and low inflation. But underneath the surface, debt burdens were once again rising faster than incomes. This was a new long-term debt cycle. Wall Street innovated with complex new products like derivatives and mortgage-backed securities. And the biggest bubble of all was inflated in the U.S. housing market. Credit standards were lowered and people were encouraged to borrow huge sums to buy houses, not just to live in, but as investments. As house prices soared, people felt wealthy. They borrowed against the rising value of their homes to finance more consumption. It was the classic bubble dynamic, the same human nature seen in the 1920s, but with new and more dangerous financial weapons. The long-term debt peak arrived in 2008. The housing bubble burst, and the global financial system, which was built on a mountain of this housing debt, froze. The world was on the brink of another Great Depression, and so another deleveraging began. And we saw the same four methods play out, but in a modern form. 1. Austerity. Many European countries, in particular, were forced to slash government spending. 2. Defaults. Major institutions like Lehman Brothers went bankrupt. 3. Wealth redistribution. The crisis sparked massive social and political anger, leading to movements like Occupy Wall Street. 4. Printing money. This time, it was called quantitative easing, QE. The Federal Reserve and other central banks printed trillions of dollars and used it to buy financial assets, propping up the system. This was a beautiful deleveraging in the sense that a total global collapse was averted. But the debt wasn't really eliminated. It was largely transferred from the private sector to the government. The machine was saved, but it was now carrying a heavier load of debt than ever before. Which brings us to today. The deleveraging that began in 2008 never fully finished. Instead, the machine was papered over with a decade of near-zero interest rates and QE. Then, in 2020, it was hit by a massive external shock, the COVID-19 pandemic. The machine's response was the most dramatic in history. For the first time, the central government and the central bank cooperated on a colossal scale. Governments spent trillions on stimulus programs, sending checks directly to people. Central banks printed trillions to finance this spending. Total spending exploded, but at the same time global supply chains broke down. The production of goods and services fell. This was the perfect recipe for a massive surge in inflation, a historic amount of money and credit chasing a limited supply of goods. Seeing this inflation, central banks around the world did what the template predicts. They began to raise interest rates at the fastest pace in decades. They are now trying to engineer a short-term debt cycle downturn to cool the economy and bring inflation back under control without causing a severe recession. We are living through a real-time demonstration of the economic machine at work. The forces of credit, debt, inflation, and the actions of central banks are playing out exactly as the template suggests. So where does this leave us? Where are we in the grand cycle of the machine? All the signs suggest we are at or near the end of a very long-term debt cycle that began in the 1940s. Government debt levels around the world are at historic highs, even greater than after World War II. Interest rates, after being at zero for a decade, have risen, making the cost of servicing this massive debt a huge burden. At the same time, we see the classic symptoms that appear at the end of these long cycles: large wealth gaps, which lead to rising social and political polarization within countries and rising conflicts between countries, especially between debtor nations and creditor nations like the US and China. Lessons from the past tells us that when debt burdens get this high, and the traditional tools of lowering interest rates no longer work, the system reaches a breaking point. The 4 levers of deleveraging, cutting spending, defaults, wealth transfers, and money printing, will have to be used again. The future of the machine will be defined by how policymakers navigate this difficult period. Will they find the right balance for a beautiful deleveraging? Or will one of the forces, inflation, depression, or social conflict, overwhelm the system? The code of the machine is predictable. The actions of the humans who run it are not. The economic machine can seem terrifying, but its mechanics are not a mystery. Understanding the code gives you the power to see the world more clearly and to make better decisions for yourself and your family. It all comes down to 3 simple rules of thumb. First, don't have debt rise faster than income, because your debt burdens will eventually crush you. This is true for a person taking on too much credit card debt, a company borrowing too much, or a government with a spiraling deficit. Second, don't have income rise faster than productivity, because you will eventually become uncompetitive. This is the lesson of the 1970s. If you are paid more without producing more, that is the definition of inflation, and it will eventually make you poorer. And third, do all that you can to raise your productivity, because in the long run, that is what matters most. Productivity is what drives real sustainable improvements in our living standards. It's what makes the pie bigger for everyone. This is simple advice for you, and it's simple advice for policymakers. This video is not a crystal ball, but it is a map. A map that shows you where we have been, where we are now, and where we are probably headed. The machine will keep running. The cycles will keep turning. But now you understand the code. Please don't forget to subscribe.